I know, I don't blame you. I don't blame you. Oh, good, it's all, we're all up and running.
Yes, of course.
Okay. Oh.
Just check and see if they can hear you.
Good morning. Just checking the mic.
Can everybody hear okay?
Can you hear that okay? Yeah, thank you. If someone could let me know if for any reason you can't hear, that would be great.
I'll leave you to.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to what I believe is your last lecture for the year. Congratulations on getting this far, and I'm quite amazed that so many of you have turned up today, so it's very good of you. My name's Alison Bell. I'm the Knowledge Translation Officer at the Recover Injury Research Centre, which is a research centre within the Faculty of Health and Behavioural Sciences here at UQ, although we are actually based at the Hurston campus, not here in St Lucia. Thank you. My spare batteries. Okay, so Recover is a research centre, as I said, in the Health and Behavioural Faculty, and the primary goal of this centre is to improve the health outcomes of people who have been injured in a motor vehicle crash. And so my journey to Recover was quite a long one. I'm a graduate of this school myself, quite a few years back now, and after graduation I spent 10 years at the Queensland Institute of Medical Research as a research officer, and then I returned to University of Queensland where I worked as a research assistant and a project manager for many years, and during that time I completed my Masters of Public Health, as you can see me receiving my award there. And then for the last 3 years I've been at Recover as the Knowledge Translation Officer. So for the majority of my career I've been involved in the knowledge creation side of research. So my role has been primarily to ensure that research objectives are met and that protocols are adhered to. And that in this diagram, that is steps 1 through to 3 in the knowledge creation side. Step 4, which of course is telling others about your research results, is generally from my past occupations was more in funding reports and in doing literature reviews or publications about the research. So at Recover, as the Knowledge Translation Officer, my role is quite different. There I am working with researchers to help them translate their research findings into real-world contexts. So the knowledge translation or the knowledge action side of this diagram. Points 4 through to 6. So in the last 3 years, I've been working as a Knowledge Translation Officer, as I said, and I'd like to give you an overview of what I've learned in that time. We'll talk about what knowledge translation is and why it's important, what knowledge actually can be translated, because not all knowledge is ready to translate. I'll give you some types of knowledge translation activities that you can conduct and some real-world examples. We'll talk about when knowledge is translated, how long the whole process takes, and how knowledge is implemented into practice, which is a sub-part of knowledge translation itself. We'll talk about what I think are the key components of a knowledge translation plan if you're planning for your own research, and at the end I'll show you some examples from Recover. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them or save them till the end. This lecture will probably only go for about 50 minutes to an hour, plus some questions, so you'll be able to get out of here early today. Oh, and of course you can feel free to, I've got my details at the end, you feel free to contact me afterwards if you want any more information or references or links that I've discussed. So what is knowledge translation? Well, the first thing that I learned when I started this role was that it's very difficult to get an actual handle on what it is. There's loads of definitions and terms out there in the literature. Here's some formal definitions from the World Health Organisation and our own National Health and Medical Research Council. But probably the most widely used definition is the one here from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. It's quite wordy, but it does encompass some of the key components of knowledge translation. In that it's iterative, in that it feeds back on itself. It's ethically sound, or at least it should be ethically sound. And its aim, or its overarching goal, is to improve and strengthen health services or health systems. Which reminds me, all of the examples that I'll be giving you today are from health, but other disciplines, of course, try to translate or do translate their knowledge, and there's some great lessons to be learned from the other disciplines as well. So here's some plain language definitions. Make it a little bit easier to grasp the concept. Knowledge translation is making research findings understandable and usable to a broad audience. It's also about the science of moving research into policy and practice, or simply just putting research into practice. The key message, I think, to take home is that knowledge translation is all about moving from the knowledge creation, if you remember that diagram, through to knowledge use. A lot of research in health, a lot of research never makes its way into the public domain. In fact, I think the latest literature review I read, only about 14% of research findings find their way into clinical practice. So we've got quite a long way to go. So this slide shows a number of the concepts that are related to knowledge translation. There's numerous terms which describe it. In fact, there's around 100 that are used in the literature quite commonly. So all of these terms are somehow related to each other or establishing or supporting research impact. And the first few there are pretty self-explanatory and are often used interchangeably, which is another reason it's quite difficult sometimes to get a handle on what part of the process a researcher might be talking about. However, technology transfer is about the marketability of health technologies and involves the transfer to industry or the commercialisation of a product. So in that instance, you might be talking about a medical aid or a new vaccine, and you're transferring that into the market. Translational research is a term specific to medical research, and it involves taking the findings from basic science and applying them to enhance health and well-being. In this type of research, the end goal would be new treatments or perhaps new medications. And implementation science, or implementation, refers to the strategies that are used for the uptake of evidence. So if you think of knowledge translation as a paradigm, implementation science sits within that paradigm. Excuse me. So why is knowledge translation important? Well, it's very important to different groups for different reasons. The government, who fund the vast majority of scientific research, both overseas and in Australia, want to know that they're getting the best possible benefits from their investments. They want to see value for money. Increasingly, funding bodies will ask you to demonstrate what your research impact will be and to show your knowledge translation plan as part of your grant. Researchers want to add to a body of research. They also want to achieve research impact, and they want to demonstrate the benefits and the relevance of their research. Practitioners want to improve their knowledge base and to inform and influence their own practice by using the best evidence that's available. Policymakers want to use research to influence policy change, and if you think about things like in Queensland, the alcohol lockout laws were informed by research. and nationally things like vaccination plans for children. They are heavily informed by research. So policymakers want to use those outputs to inform the policy change. And lastly, but probably the most importantly, patients and the community members who not only pay taxes which contribute to our research funds, but who also want and deserve the best treatments that are possible. So another very important reason to have knowledge translation is to reduce the time lag from knowledge production through to knowledge use, and I'll talk a little bit more about that time lag later. It's often referred to as the evidence practice gap or the evidence policy gap. So new evidence has come out, but it hasn't yet made it into policy or practice. Oh, and let's have a, sorry. Okay, so here's another good quote, or a good quote that explains what a lack of knowledge translation may do. So if you don't have knowledge translation, it may lead to underuse of efficacious treatments or incorrect use of treatments or excessive use of treatments that are not necessary, and thus deprive patients of optimal care. So what knowledge can be translated? Well, deciding what research findings or knowledge can be translated depends on the level of evidence that you have, how ready your evidence is, and who is the intended audience. So, for instance, if your audience is other researchers or your funding body, you may well translate, in fact you'd be encouraged to translate preliminary findings even, and certainly your primary research results from a single study. But that wouldn't be enough to translate that into the wider community, obviously. If your audience is healthcare providers or policymakers or consumers themselves, you would really want a synthesis of research findings, a well-tested body of research, supported by systematic reviews, perhaps expert panel reviews. And not all research is ready to be translated. In fact, research done in the natural sciences is often all about discovery. So I'd just like to show you a short video that illustrates this point, and hopefully it will all go smoothly.
Finally, a NewsHour essay. Biologist Sheila Patek has faced political criticism for her research on mantis shrimp and trapjaw ants. In recent months, members of Congress have called her studies a waste of taxpayer money. Tonight, she explains how dismissing her work misses the aim of scientific research and discovery.
Some years ago, I presented my lab's discoveries to a group of leading thinkers and public figures. We discovered that mantis shrimp use hammers equivalent to the mass of 2 toothpicks and move them with the acceleration of a bullet to pulverize thick snail shells. We discovered that tiny trapjaw ants close their jaws with 100,000 times the acceleration of a sprinting cheetah. I expressed the wonder of these discoveries as well as their fundamental significance to physics, evolution, and the limits of current engineering capabilities. A prominent lawyer from Nigeria who was in the audience that day approached me a few days later. Her first words to me were, "Your research disgusted me with such waste, studying trivial and useless problems." In that moment, she had voiced my most vulnerable thoughts, that the science to which I dedicated much of my life was actually pointless. But, she added, I realized something important, that science is about discovery, not just about solving human problems. She then spoke a phrase that has stuck with me through the years. She said, "I want what you have for my country." In her country, Nigeria, there was simply no infrastructure for this type of discovery-based research. In fact, many solutions to human problems begin in a scientist's laboratory. Did you know that some of the most significant medical breakthroughs for the human brain began with research on sea slugs? The value of my work came under attack again when Republican Senator Jeff Flake featured it in a waste book. That's a partisan report that highlights what some in Congress see as wasteful government spending. They ridiculed a research project in my lab that showed how mantis shrimp use their lethal weapons to resolve conflicts without killing each other. But if you think about it, this is a fundamental question for any animal or human system that has lethal capabilities. In response to the Wastebook attack, I was invited to present my research on Capitol Hill. Senator Flake came to the event, and I spoke to him one-on-one. I told him the story of one of the many unanticipated paths from my lab's discoveries to human applications. I explained how the extraordinarily intense impacts of mantis shrimp hammers inspired engineers to make new materials. One day, this might result in lightweight, impact-resistant sports helmets and military armor. He actually seemed engaged, so I asked him, did any of my research seem worthwhile? Senator Flake said yes. He was especially interested in the novel engineering products. These fundamental discoveries and their potential for translation are why my research program is funded by the Department of Defense and the National Science Foundation. However, engineering-related applications are not the primary reason we do this research. The nature of discovery is that it is impossible to anticipate what you'll find. That is discovery. Discovery-based research is most fruitful when new knowledge is sought for its own sake.
Okay, so you can see from that video that discovery research is not ready to translate. However, I would argue that Professor Patek's video itself is actually a translation activity, and you'll see later why I might say that. She's demonstrated the value of her research, the direction that it's going, and it's a very plain language description that anyone, even outside of the biology and natural sciences area, would be able to understand and get a bit of an understanding. Things like that brain research has been, come from slugs and all sorts of things. So it's very interesting in itself. So if you do have some research that's ready to translate, what kind of activities can you conduct? Knowledge translation occurs on a continuum from very passive activities, which are diffusing or getting your research out there, right through to much more active dissemination and implementation activities. So diffusion activities would be more of the traditional style, which getting a journal article published and it goes out into the academic community. With dissemination activities, you would be collaborating with your audience or end users more actively, and you may package up some of your research to conduct perhaps educational settings, an educational session rather, or a workshop or a webinar. And implementation is a much more active process where it's driven by the researcher and the end user. Usually there's a gap that's been identified and you're filling that gap. And you would have to be actively involved and supporting the uptake of a tool or a change of practice. So let's look at some examples of some research outputs that would fit under those types of headings. The first list includes some very traditional diffusion or dissemination activities that you'd be familiar with. Journal articles, as I mentioned earlier, plain language summaries or brochures, conference presentations, posters, and media interviews where expert opinion is required. So some commentators have been questioning the time and the costs involved in some of these traditional activities, claiming that very few outside of academia can actually access or understand these types of activities. So in response, some new and sometimes novel activities are occurring more and more, such as the things in the list on the right. So plain language summaries, again, are becoming almost a prerequisite nowadays. If you publish an article, you would also have a companion document that explains your research in lay terms. Infographics are being used more, self-submitted media articles such as those to the conversation, social media, of course, and social media is being used more and more for preliminary results. In the past, researchers were quite hesitant to release any preliminary results, whereas nowadays young researchers in particular are tweeting and Facebooking their progress, which can become a taster for people interested in the results. There's some other examples there. So here's some other types of research outputs that would be ready for dissemination or in some cases implementation. So you'd be familiar with DSM criteria, clinical practice guidelines, clinical tools, mobile phone apps. Now, with the very best of intentions and the very best of a body of research and expert panel reviews, many of these do not get picked up, and the uptake is actually very low. I can't remember the actual stats, but I think for clinical practice guidelines, something around 25% of them get used regularly in practice, so, and it may even be less. So if you think about, say for instance, you developed, that your research led you to develop a mobile phone app, perhaps you're interested in reducing people's stress levels and you develop a nifty phone app based on the outcomes of your research. So you've identified the gap that needs filling, you've spent money and time testing and validating the app, and it's ready to be released. That's great, but how does anyone know that you've got it? How do they know it's out there, and how would they select your app, which is evidence-based, as compared to the many other apps, as I'm sure you know, that are not evidence-based, that are out there? So to do that, you would require a very clear dissemination and implementation plan, and probably a lot of resources as well to market your app and to make it stand out. So here's a couple of real-life examples. These are, not surprisingly, from the Recover website. There's a journal article and a plain language summary, which, as I said, are being used more and more. Again, these are more traditional forms of research diffusion and dissemination, but, you know, very applicable. Sometimes researchers may not want to read the full article. These two aren't related, by the way. Sorry, they're on separate topics. But you may want to just glance at a plain language summary to get a feel for the research that someone's doing. So plain language summaries, they're definitely not intended to dumb down the research, but they're to make the information more accessible to people outside of your field and, of course, to consumers, or be more consumer friendly. There's quite a number of tools out there that can assist you to write a plain language summary. I like this one from Knowledge Translation Australia because it gives you just some simple subheadings that you can just address the question, and bingo, you have put an image and you've got a plain language summary. So you would describe your research, what you did you find, and what do the results, most importantly, what do the results mean for consumers or health professionals. And the language needs to be pitched, I think, to about a grade 10 level of reading. So a little bit higher than the newspaper, but very clear, plain language. Here's another example. This is an example from Sports Science. They're called infographics, if you're not familiar with these, and they have they're a very succinct summary of the research. They're obviously fun and colourful, and they provide just a brief overview of what the results were, and ideally should always include a link to the original research so that people can go and find out more information. The self-submitted conversation articles are becoming more and more popular. It's actually very hard to get something published in the conversation, I hear. There's a lot of competition, as you can imagine, from researchers all over Australia who want to demonstrate their research. This particular story is a fact-check story, which was in response to an article that was published in the British Telegraph online newspaper. The Telegraph had done a media release based on the results of one very small study in the UK, where they claimed that there was a clear relationship between eating chocolate and brain function. And unfortunately, the author had to write a rebuttal. And the author goes on to explain that that type of study, being cross-sectional, is great for showing a relationship between diet and health at a snapshot in time. But obviously, correlation doesn't equal causation, and to really get to the bottom of the issue, we need some more carefully designed experimental studies to examine the association between chocolate and cognitive health and the mechanisms linking them. So I guess we could all do our own experiments and see if it improves our function. So here's some further examples. These are more packaged research, again with a body of research behind them. So we have on our website a number of consumer and clinical resources. They're fairly self-explanatory there, but the clinical resources, obviously we would hope for uptake in clinical practice. Now, again, I've put implementation in brackets because we don't know how, at this stage, we're evaluating some of these tools, but we don't know what uptake we've had. You can get stuff out there, but you really need to keep promoting it and keep engaging with your end users and informing them, updating them, so that they're aware of those tools and can use them. Because I guess the ultimate goal is behaviour change or practice change. The use of video, as you saw in the first example, and I'm about to show you another, for public health messages is becoming increasingly popular. I'm going to show you a great example from the British Heart Foundation in a moment. The foundation found that the general public, particularly in the UK, had a grave fear of performing CPR on people that were suspected of having a cardiac arrest. So the public were frightened because they felt that they weren't trained or that they'd do it wrong and they just weren't confident enough to perform the procedure. But other research by the foundation showed that thousands of lives could be saved every year if people just performed the hands-only CPR, if they just had the confidence to give it a shot. So the key message of their campaign is that hands-only CPR is likely to increase a person's chance of survival, even if you really don't know what you're doing, until you see this video. And to be effective, a public health campaign has to stay on message, use plain language, and be remembered. So let's see what you think. Oh. See if you think they achieve this.
My name is Vinnie Jones, and I'm going to teach you a lesson you'll never forget. There are times in life when being tough comes in handy. Say some geezer collapses in front of you. What do? We need a volunteer that ain't breathing. Here's one I made earlier. First thing you do is you check him over. If he ain't responsive or he ain't breathing, or he's making noises like this, then his heart will stop working, he's having a cardiac arrest. Look lively. First call 999. Then you do hands-only CPR. And no kissing. You only kiss your missus on the lips. Watch. Lock your fingers together, knuckles up. Then push down, right on the sovereign. Push down 5 or 6 centimetres. That's about 2 inches in old money. Push hard and fast, about 2 times a second, like to the beat of staying alive. Worried you'll hurt him? Better a cracked rib than him kicking the bucket. Keep this up till the ambulance arrives. So don't forget, check him over. Call 999, push hard and fast to staying alive. It works. Hands only CPR. It ain't as hard as it looks. If you want to come in handy in an emergency, why not sign up for one of our Heart Start courses?
Very clever, isn't it? Yeah. Obviously, a lot of resources would be required to produce a video like that, but I would think that that video, which has been viewed by many millions of people, or hundreds of thousands of people anyway, is probably a lot more effective than printing off, you know, hundreds of brochures and dropping them in doctors' surgeries. It's a great way. So they're all some great real-world examples of research dissemination and implementation. Okay, so when is knowledge translated? And where does it fit in the research process, I guess? So you have designed your research program and you're thinking, you're planning what you're going to do. Well, where would you plan your activities, your knowledge translation activities? Traditionally, knowledge translation would occur at the end of a grant or a research project. So you'd wait until you got your results and then you would usually do a journal article or a report and perhaps some other plain language summaries, that type of thing. And you'd tailor your message to suit the audience. But increasingly, these days, you would aim to integrate your knowledge translation right from the beginning of the project. And in actual fact, you would, nowadays, that would be considered the optimal approach. And if you were writing a grant again, you would want to demonstrate that you have collaborated with the end users already and that the direction, depending on the outcome of your research, this is what you would expect at the end. It's more solutions focused. So you've identified the gap and you're wanting to fill that gap, and again, it would require a plan and some resources. And of course, you can do both, depending on the different arms of your research. You might leave some things till the end, and others you might do, other activities you may integrate from the beginning. And sometimes you might have activities that even go beyond that. If you implemented a clinical tool, for instance, you may want to be evaluating that tool and the uptake and the fidelity to ensure that people are still using it the way that it was intended. So how long does knowledge translation take? Well, if we look at smoking as an historical example, there's a great article published by the History Department of Stanford University in the US, and the article is called "The History of the Discovery of the Cigarette-Lung Cancer Link, Evidentiary Traditions, Corporate Denial and Global Toll." It's actually quite a fascinating article if you're interested in the politics behind public health decisions and changes. I'd just like to read you a little bit from the introduction of the article. Tobacco was not even suspected as a cause of lung tumours until the final decade of the 19th century. Lung cancer was still a very rare disease, so rare in fact that medical professors, when confronted with a case, sometimes told their students they may never see another. By the 1920s, however, surgeons were encountering cases with increasing frequency and starting to puzzle over what might be responsible. Smoking was commonly blamed, along with asphalt dust from newly tarred roads, industrial air pollution and latent effects from exposure to poisonous gas in the First World War or the global influenza pandemic of 1918-19. So you can see there's a lot of proposed causes. These and a number of other theories were put forward as possible explanations for the rise of lung cancer until evidence from multiple sources of inquiry made it clear that tobacco was by far and away the leading culprit. In the middle of the 20th century, 4 distinct lines of evidence converged to establish cigarette smoking as the leading cause of lung cancer. And so with this historical example, it took around 50 years for the knowledge to translate. From when the research evidence was quite clear that it was lung cancer, to beginning to implement change. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of resistance from the tobacco companies. You've probably read about some of that. And as you know, there's campaigns around the world, continue today. Excuse me. So how long does it take now? Well, things have improved vastly. It's no longer 50 years. However, on average, as this article by Morris and colleagues confirms what a number of other researchers have been saying, that on average it takes around 17 years. And if you think about from setting research priorities through to ending with changes to practice, you can see where some of those years may add up. I understand Professor Sanders came and spoke to you last week about the Triple P program, so I thought I would use that program as an example of time lag from the beginning of a research idea through to the program being disseminated. So the intervention approach had its origin in social learning theory, as you would be aware, and in the late 70s, Professor Sanders was doing his PhD here at UQ, and he was developing procedures for dealing with child behaviour and emotional problems. So from the early 80s through to the mid-90s, the clinical training and research operation developed at UQ, and the core programs were designed and tested. In 93, the program got its name, and in 94, a number of clinical trials of the programs were completed. So the body of research obviously is building by then. In 95, the first resources are published, and in 96, the Parenting and Family Support Centre was established here at the UQ School of Psychology. And then wasn't until the late 90s that there was a move from clinical research through to a small operation to train allied health professionals nationally. And then, of course, from there, the rest is history. And, you know, it's gone all over the world. So you can see from the beginning of the idea through to allied health professionals adopting, that's a 20-year span on that in this example. So how can we reduce this time lag? And there's a number of theories designed to assist researchers to do that. And it's argued that to be successful, implementation activities require planning that is underpinned by theory. So implementation science or implementation theories themselves are all about the how-to, or how best to gain uptake and change for, say, clinical practice. And the theories provide a framework or methodology for planning and evaluating the changes as well. So the theoretical approaches have three overarching aims. They describe or guide the process of translating the research into practice. They help you understand or explain what influences the outcomes. And also there's theories that help you evaluate the success of the outcomes, or the implementation, I should say. So implementation science itself is an evolving field, and there are numerous theories. This slide shows some of the most widely cited theories, but there are many more. Some of them are being used more and more in research now. To varying degrees. Researchers, a recent review I read showed that researchers tend to cherry pick the parts of the theory that suits their context, which makes sense, but it also makes it very difficult to compare how certain theories, how effective certain theories may be as compared to others. So there's a big push now for people to use the theories a little bit more as they were designed. Each model, of course, has a slightly different approach and has its own strengths and weaknesses, and you would pick the one that's most suitable for your context. And the models all outline the things to consider in the process of bringing evidence into practice, such as the context, the stakeholders involved, and the factors associated with successful implementation. So let's look at a couple of these in a little bit more detail. I wouldn't expect you to remember these, it's just to give you an overview, because they're quite complex. So the Knowledge to Action framework was developed in Canada by Graham and colleagues in the 2000s, and it's a conceptual framework that's intended to address the need for conceptual clarity in the knowledge to action field and to offer a framework of the key elements of the process. So this framework helps you identify the problem and review and select the knowledge that will fill the gap. You then adapt your evidence for the local context, identify the barriers to the specific behavioural change, select, tailor and implement the strategies that are appropriate that address the barriers. There will always be barriers in the real world, whether that's people or systems or financial, personnel. There's a number of reasons, a number of barriers that you would need to overcome. And it also helps you monitor the knowledge use and evaluate the use and the sustained use of your research. There's a nifty diagram there that you'll see. If you read anything in theory, this is a very widely cited framework. Let's look at another. This is probably, from my perspective, the most intuitive framework if you're new to knowledge implementation. It's the Promoting Action on Research Implementation in Health Sciences, or more commonly referred to as the Paris framework or Paris model. It's a determinant framework, and it's designed for public health practitioners mainly for use in clinical settings. And it places great emphasis on where you plan the change to occur and the importance of skilled facilitators. And facilitators are those people that are embedded in the environment that you want the change to occur. And facilitators are often referred to as champions or research champions. They're the champions, they're the people that are going to support the change for you and drive the change. And these are people on the ground. Generally, you would want management and systems, say if you were implementing something in a hospital ward, to be on board, but unless the people working in the ward at the coalface are supportive, you won't have, you'll have little change. So according to the model, there are three intersecting factors which determine the uptake of research findings. The evidence that you have, so how reliable, how valid, how respected is that evidence that supports the research, obviously the research outcome. The context, so that, as I said, that might be a clinical setting or another community setting. And the level of facilitation or support that you have for the change. According to the model, when a project scores highly on all three of these domains, the more successful your implementation will be. And there's a matrix, coloured matrix, that you can fill out to score that. It's, as I said, it's a very intuitive model, and I find it's a good one, a good starting model. Here's a little bit more about the reasons why. Those concepts are so important. Okay, so another way that we can reduce the knowledge to practice gap, or the time lag, is by planning. You want to plan your project and plan your knowledge translation and implementation activities. The best way to ensure that your project outcomes are adopted into policy or practice is to plan early and to plan well. And this is separate from the theories that may guide your plan. This is your actual plan, how you're going to implement it. So nowadays, you'd start your planning right back at the grant writing stage, or at the idea stage, perhaps when you're submitting your ethics application and you're outlining your project and how you expect it to unfold, and how you what uptake you expect, what impact you expect. So, and again, nearly all grants these days would expect that you would have this sorted. So here's some of the key components of a knowledge translation plan. There are others, and again, it's to do with your context. where you're going to implement, but these are the key, I would think, the key components. So you want to be very clear about what your main messages and goals are. So you may have different arms of your research and only one of those is the goal that you have for your translation. It's not your full research. You really and truly need to identify who your target audience are or the knowledge users. So who's going to use it? Who are the people that you're targeting? How are you going to target them? How are you going to engage them? Have you spoken to them before? Are they already on board? You would need to assess the barriers and all the facilitators to your research being translated or implemented. You might do that with your research yourself. You might conduct some pilot studies, or you might review the literature or conduct an audit in a setting, so that you really get a good handle on the barriers, and then you can address those. You want to clearly outline the strategies that you're going to use to implement. And I haven't gone into this much today, but as you can imagine, there's quite a lot of literature around the best strategies for different environments, because not all strategies work across all environments. So you want to think about the context and how you want and whose behaviour you want to change. So it might be educational materials or educational sessions. In hospitals and physio departments, they generally have like a toolbox session where you could go along and talk about the change or that you wanted to implement, or you would try and get on board some opinion leaders, so people who are experts in this field to come and support you and say what a great idea it is, and if only we had this change. And if you think about things like hand washing or hand sanitation in hospitals, a few years ago, those hand washing and hand sanitation were very poor in hospitals, and change was actually driven by nursing staff and research that they conducted, and it's been implemented across just about all the hospitals in Australia now. You'd also, of course, need to identify what resources are required, and that's financial and personnel. So you can see it's quite a lot to consider. And for one small thing you want to implement, this will all be really simple. But if it's a complex change, then obviously it'll be much more complex. So I've provided you some links to some great planning tools that you can come back to when you're ready and you want to get your research out there. The Canadians are really leading in this area, and there's a couple there from Canada that are terrific. One helps you design your plan, and another is really a checklist that you can work through. Yes, I've done that. Yes, I've done that. And it just helps keep you on track. And the third one down the bottom is for a context-specific translation, and that's for in the telehealth area. But although it's quite possible that could be used in other contexts as well, you could again take. So you can use theories or models, and there's also, as I said, lots of guides to assist you. The Canadian ones, and actually this telehealth one, are all informed by theory as well. So someone's already done a lot of the work for you. So we've done the full circle, and I'd just like to come back to Recover and just give you some examples of some of the translation activities that were occurring there, which will help give you a bit of a feel for some real-life translation. You might remember that Recover is interested in doing, or we do research on post-motor vehicle accident injuries mainly. We have 3 research programs. The first is about improving the delivery and availability of evidence-based services, and it has a tele-rehabilitation focus, so using technology to communicate with people, not just in regional areas, but also people who maybe have a chronic illness or be incapacitated and unable to attend appointments. We have another program which is designing better therapies, and that has a musculoskeletal injury focus and more specifically whiplash.
When you refer to telehealth,
yes.
Are you talking phone-based or step-based? I suppose you used a few times on the call, have you not?
Yeah. No, that's okay. All. So all technologies, although telerehabilitation in its bigger is more internet-based. So there's labs here on the university. School of Health and Rehab Sciences has a telerehabilitation lab, for instance, and its focus is on internet-based communications.
So it's basically remote.
Remote applications, yeah. So, for instance, you might have designed a speech therapy program that you want to implement to people in regional areas. I use that example, and you can run it via the technology, as long as the person has internet, suitable internet. There's quite a bit involved. Telerehabilitation is being used more and more. Telehealth is the broader term that encompasses mobile apps and all sorts of different ones here. The third research program that we have at Recover is about facilitating return to pre-injury functioning. So that's returning back to work or your usual social activities after you may have had an injury or you've had an injury. And we conduct a number of translation activities, publications, of course, research centres, we need those. We do presentations at national and international conferences, plain language summaries, as I've shown you. We've got evidence-based treatment resources on our website, and we have a number of clinical tools. And one of those tools is a tool called WIP Predict, which is a clinical prediction rule. It's used as a risk stratification tool for people who've had a whiplash injury. So it's research generated and it's evidence-based, and it's designed to predict the outcomes or the likelihood of people having moderate through to severe disability after their whiplash injury. So you might not be aware, but if whiplash injury, around 50% of individuals who have a whiplash injury, which is usually caused by a motor vehicle accident, although it can be caused by sports as well, around 50% of people recover with very little intervention, just a bit of time and rest. About 25% experience mild levels of disability, and another 25% develop persistent, moderate, severe pain and disability, and it really does impact on their lives. So this tool is designed to help predict what outcome a person may have, and therefore you can tailor treatments to suit the prediction. So the tool's available in hard copy and electronic version via the website, and it's self-administered by the patient. So although it's self-administered by the patient, the results, we've designed it so that the results go to their healthcare practitioner. The patient doesn't get the results themselves directly because we don't want to scare them if they would, had a result that said that they would be at high risk of injury. We'd like the health professional to work through that with them. They answer questions about their neck disability and their hyperarousal symptoms, which is measured by post-traumatic diagnostic scale. A combination of those, along with age, indicates what risk a patient would be at. So, thinking back to those other slides about when and how and what's ready and when you would do it, with the WIP Predict tool, the knowledge is well and truly ready for use. There's been clinical trials, there's been loads of publications, it's been externally validated, there's been an expert panel review, there's been feedback, it's well developed. It was an end of grant or end of project knowledge translation activity. It was the results that came out of research showed that we could predict risk, so we developed the tool afterwards. At the beginning, wasn't a plan. But the goals are obviously for uptake of the tool into practice and to have practice change. And the end users are the physiotherapists, chiropractors and GPs who would be the health professionals someone would go to if they have a whiplash injury. There's something else I was going to say there. It's gone. It'll come to me. Okay, so Oh, that's what I was going to say, yes. The goal is the uptake, but we don't know at this stage what that will be, because we're only at the stage of trying to implement it now and disseminate and implement it. So to do that, we've started to engage our end users by publications and presentations, educational sessions. We've done workshops with allied health professionals. As I said, it's available. It's widely available. We can distribute it. And we're currently working on implementation and evaluation strategies to gain further uptake. So what we're planning to do is send an e-newsletter with a link to the tool to all Queensland physiotherapists. That's going to happen very shortly. And we've got a national rollout planned. Oh, and I meant to say earlier that the Australian Physiotherapy Association fully support the tool and endorse it. So that gives us the credibility I was talking about earlier, about having a champion or credible experts behind you. And that's the end of my talk. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask them, or otherwise, congratulations on finishing, and well done. Yes. Yep. Yeah, I would think about those three intersecting factors, and otherwise for the exam, I've kept it very straightforward. So, what is knowledge translation? Why is it important? And what would be certain examples? So, oh, that's been recorded. Hi, how are you? Yes. Oh, you poor thing. Yeah, okay, sure. Yes, okay, so that's where I was talking about the three intersecting factors, so facilitation, if you go, so it's the two, I go into a little bit more detail, two of the models of translation, and one of them talks about what three factors would make a successful implementation plan.
Oh, okay.
And the rest is, as I just said, is will just be very straightforward. Just glaze over the slides. Hi, Abby.
Hello.
How are you?
Good, great.
Oh, thank you.
My
Did
stuff
it?
got cleared.
Fantastic. How do I turn this off?
Good, excellent. I'm glad. No, it's because as long as you that open, yeah. Yeah.
Now, I don't really have much of an update on the literature review, except that all the searches are complete. I've gone through all the duplicates are removed. I'm just waiting on a conference license that we can use because there wasn't enough, so they had to pick another one. And then that's it. As soon as I get that, I'll be in touch with the meeting and work out a strategy.
Has they already said yes to the meeting?
Indirectly, yes.
Yeah.
As I said to her, she was asking that last time, I told her that they requested you to set the quota, and she didn't. I sent her an email asking for permission, and she did, but she said yes.
Yeah.
It's hard to get, so I'm taking that client that's okay.
Yeah.
And I'm meeting with Michelle as well, and I'll check with her. If there's a problem with it. And then
I still don't mind help.
I know, it's great experience.
Yeah.
It's best that they've got me through it because I don't want to take you away from other things.
Well, it's going to be helping me. It's going to help.
It'll be great.
No knowledge is you based.
No, this knowledge actually is so good.
Yeah.
And you've already got your license, so I understand.
Vanessa did mention it that she's going to get it.
So that's for your week too, which would be great. So you'll be learning that. There's, if you go onto Google, and look up Providence Reference Manager Data System, whatever it's called, their website just has a little bit of background, but I found on YouTube some webinars of instructional how to use it, run by the Consent
Okay.
and developed it.
Okay.
I'll try and remember to send you the link, but I've had a look at a couple of those in books.
Yeah. Would you be able to send me the slides of today's
Yes,
lecture?
of course.
Yeah. And yeah, I'll wait for you to send me an email. I'm just in the process of finalizing my my topic of systemic review as well, because they want me to do another one.
Yes.
Most likely it's going to be around implementation strategies that have worked for issues.
Great. That's good because the one we'll be doing is the broader. We're not looking at what was successful, we're just looking at
The barriers
what are the
and the
barriers.
precedents.
Exactly. And so there'll be in some of those papers there'll be discussion of those, even the abstract review of feel for what's going on in the area and what's been successful, that would be really good. And I would think too, I don't know, Michelle's probably mentioned it in your discussions, but she's also interested in obviously risk stratification terms.
Yes.
So not just other types of treatment, and also what's important is what didn't work.
Yes, I'm not going to be doing it only successful, but I'm basically thinking of knowledge translation or implementation strategies for.
You can use both terms. In fact, as I said, knowledge translation is the overarching term, and most people would use that, and it's just part of it. Knowledge translation is the physio, and it'll be very interesting to see how many of those were guided by theory, or if they just used a guide and come up with a plan. And it's interesting because there's only a little bit of literature around what's successful.
Yeah. They keep talking about the active and the passive modes and all that, but there's no concrete plan in terms of what has worked, especially in uptaking the clinical guidelines and stuff.
So I think that'll be very important.
Because that's going to be my PhD.
Yes, that'll be very important area. And it's also that will just inform exactly where you want to go. And that's the other question that she was asking me about, was she's particularly interested in knowledge translation and what's the right background. She's doing health psychology, which is her background, because she was all over behaviour change, and that, so she'll be able to use those skills. But from your perspective, you're interested in getting to the nut of it, so that you can assist physios to change. It's the future.
Yeah.
It is the future. We're right on track.